No one stepped forward for the bride because people thought she was too old, until a small girl pointed and said, "That's her. That's my mama." Dry Creek. Population 1,889. The noon sun hung heavy over the little train stop like a hot coin, pouring hard light onto the boards and iron rails. Each gust lifted dust into the air, turning everything the color of clay. Wagons creaked. Horses blew and stamped. Folks from Dry Creek crowded the platform. Store owners with sleeves rolled to the elbow. Ranch hands smelling of leather and sweat. Mothers in faded bonnets gripping the hands of their little ones. They'd come to see the mail-order brides. For weeks, people had whispered about them in the saloon and the mercantile. These women had answered ads printed back east by lonely men in the wide West. They were said to be traveling from places like Boston and Baltimore, dragging trunks and hopes, planning to step off a train and into a husband's life. Dry Creek hadn't seen anything like it in years, and the town buzzed like a hive. The whistle wailed low and long. A dark locomotive rose out of the heat shimmer, breathing steam and smoke into the bright sky. Screeching brakes. Clanging metal. The cars shuddered to a stop. The crowd pressed in. Kids leaned forward. Men tipped their hats. 3 young women stepped off first. One with hair pale as corn silk was claimed at once by a freckled rancher. Another, small and dark, rushed into the arms of a smiling fellow in a new suit. The third, pink-cheeked from the ride, was wrapped in a hug by a bearded homesteader who hoisted her trunk like it was light as a loaf of bread. The platform burst with cheers. The air smelled of coal smoke and perfume. Then another woman appeared. She looked about 30, though sun and time had sketched faint lines near her eyes. Her dress was plain, gray calico neatly pressed. She held a worn carpet bag in one hand and a folded letter in the other. Brown hair was pinned tight beneath a modest hat. She stepped down carefully and searched the faces. Her eyes, a deep, tired blue, hunted for someone who did not come. No man claimed her. She stood alone while the last passengers hurried off. The conductor called to the porter, jumped back aboard, and with a snort of steam the train started away. Wheels rattled. Cars rolled. The long snake of iron slid toward the horizon until it was only a line in the bright distance. Dust lifted, then settled again. People stared. Whispers moved through the crowd like wind in dry grass. "She's too old," a woman muttered behind a gloved hand. "Who'd want a widow that age?" a man said near the hitching post. "Bet he changed his mind," someone snickered. She heard them. Her fingers squeezed the letter until the crease grew white. It held a promise in a stranger's handwriting. A man named Thomas Reed had asked her to come west and marry him. She'd read those lines again and again during the long ride until she knew every mark of ink. Now the platform was empty except for her and her trunk. Heat touched her cheeks, not from the sun alone. She lifted her chin and steadied her breath. The dust burned her eyes, but she refused to cry. The crowd thinned. A wagon rolled away, wheels popping gravel. A man spat tobacco and headed for the saloon. The air pressed on her, heavy with the weight of being looked at but not chosen. From the far side of the platform, a small shape appeared. A little girl of about 6, hair the color of wheat, wearing a patched gingham dress and carrying a rag doll by a limp arm. She had been skipping along the boards, chasing sunlight that slipped between the slats. She slowed when she saw the woman. Her wide eyes studied the stranger's face, as if matching it to a picture in her mind. The doll swung back and forth. The woman tried a thin, unsure smile. Something in the child's stare pricked her, an odd blend of recognition and hope. The girl stepped closer. She glanced over her shoulder and then back, chest rising and falling as if she had run. She parted her lips, shut them, then tried again. "That's her," the girl said, high and clear. A small finger pointed straight at the woman. "That's my mama." Everything on the platform stopped. Boots halted. A parasol slipped from a woman's hand and clattered on the boards. A horse tossed its head and snorted. Gossip died midward. Every eye swung to the girl and the stranger she claimed. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, dust hanging in the light. The woman's heart was hammered. She stared at the child, frozen, the letter wrinkled in her fist. She did not know this girl, and had never seen her before. Yet something flickered across her face, shock, confusion, and a softer thing like a faint echo of a long-ago wish. A moment before, the crowd had been loud with judgment. Now they stood hushed, caught between doubt and wonder. Her name was Margaret Callahan, though people who came to know her called her Maggie. Before the war, she had taught school. During it, she stitched wounds and held hands in field tents that smelled of smoke and blood. Afterward, she buried a husband who had come home in body, but not in spirit from the battlefields of Tennessee. And now, in Dry Creek, she was neither wife nor widow by the town's measure, just a woman alone in a hard land. The little girl still held her gaze. Maggie breathed and managed, "Sweetheart, I think you've mistaken me for someone else." The girl shook her head. "No. I saw you in my dream. You came on a train like this, and you smiled like that." Maggie wasn't truly smiling. Not really. She glanced around. A few people still watched, their curiosity mixed with something uneasy. One mother drew her child away. A mustached man muttered and strode off. Maggie noticed the hotel across the street, a modest two-story house with lace curtains and a sign that read, "Dry Creek Boarding House Tea Room." She gathered her things with what pride she could and headed that way, the little girl trotting beside her. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and old dust. The desk clerk lifted his head from a ledger. "I'd like a room," Maggie said. He looked her up and down, then glanced at the girl. "Where's your husband?" He's been delayed," Maggie answered, keeping her voice level. The clerk frowned. "Ma'am, we don't rent to unaccompanied women, without a letter of character or a man in town to vouch." "I have a letter," she said quickly, holding out the folded page. "From Thomas Reed, the man who sent for me." He skimmed the first lines, shrugged, and slid it back. "If he ain't here to claim you, that paper's no good. I've got rules." Maggie stood still, throat tight. "I have nowhere else. There's the church," he said, "or maybe some kind soul. But I've got paying customers. Good day." He turned away. Outside, the wind picked up, throwing grit against her cheeks. She stood on the boardwalk and tried to think. She couldn't go back east. Every dollar she had saved from sewing and scrubbing had bought that train ticket. She had risked it all on a promise, and the man had not come. The little girl tugged her sleeve. "You can come home with me," she said, simple as anything. "We have biscuits. My doll smells like cinnamon." Maggie's heart twisted. "What's your name, darling?" "Ellie," the child said proudly. "Ellie Kane." "Well, Ellie Kane," Maggie answered, kneeling so they were eye to eye, "I think your mama and papa will worry if you keep running off." "I don't have a mama," Ellie said in a matter-of-fact way. "She went to heaven when I was 3. Papa says she watches from the stars, but I think maybe she came back as someone else." Maggie stared at her. She ought to correct the child. She should find the sheriff or the church, or go anywhere else. But Ellie's small hand slid into hers, warm and sure. And Maggie, who had belonged to no one for so long, let her fingers hold on. Boots struck the boardwalk, fast and hard. "Ellie." The little girl froze. Maggie looked up. A tall man was striding toward them from the direction of the smithy, broad-shouldered, sun-browned, with a beard shadowing his jaw and eyes like storm clouds. He wore a work shirt with sleeves rolled, and a carpenter's apron dusted with sawdust. He stopped when he saw them together. "Papa," Ellie chirped. "Step away from her. he said, quiet but sharp as a knife's edge. You do not run off like that. Ellie clutched Maggie's hand tighter. She's not a stranger. She's my mama. The man, Jonah Kane, blinked. His mouth opened, then shut. He looked at Maggie, truly looked this time. Heat rose in Maggie's face, not from attraction, but from pure mortification. She stood straight and moved a step back. I assure you, sir, I didn't. She followed me, Maggie said. Ellie cut in. She didn't do anything wrong. I found her. Jonah crouched and set his hands on Ellie's small shoulders. Sweetheart, you know better. You don't go off with people you don't know. But I do know her, Ellie insisted. I saw her in my dream. She came on the train. She looked at me just like this. Jonah exhaled through his nose and stood. A few folks had lingered to watch. Someone snickered. Looks like the kid's got more sense than her pa. Maggie stiffened. This is a misunderstanding, she said. I'll be on my way. She turned to leave, but Ellie's small cry stopped her. Please don't go. She's supposed to be here, Papa. I prayed for her. Jonah hesitated. Clouds were rolling in over the hills, casting a gray shade over the street. The wind tasted like thunder. He looked at Maggie again, tired, alone, travel-wrinkled dress, a letter still folded in her hand. The child clung to her, as if she belonged there. He dragged a hand down his beard side and asked, Where are you staying? I have nowhere, Maggie admitted. The boarding house refused me. He nodded, jaw tight. It'll rain soon. Come to our place. One night. That's not necessary. I didn't say it was, he replied, already turning. But I won't have my girl walking home in a storm. Ellie beamed and grabbed Maggie's hand again, skipping while Jonah led the way. Their home set a short walk past the edge of town. A neat wooden cottage, smoke curling from the chimney, stacks of split logs lined up by the porch. Chickens scratched near a small shed. A wagon rested under an awning. Inside, the air smelled of pine and sawdust. The furniture was sturdy and handmade. There were few decorations, a faded photograph on the mantel, a pair of sewing shears hung on a nail, a worn quilt folded at the foot of the couch. Jonah lit a lamp and motioned to a chair. Sit. I'll fetch a basin. Maggie sat stiffly. Ellie plopped on the rug with her doll. This is Betsy, she told her. She's had a rough year too. Jonah came. Back with a basin and cloth. You can wash up in the kitchen. Thank you, Maggie said softly. He nodded once and retreated to the far side of the room. He took a small block of wood and a carving knife and went to work. He didn't speak again. That night, after supper, Ellie fell asleep with her head in Maggie's lap. Jonah looked up from his corner. Lamplight brushed his face in warm gold, softening it. He didn't smile, but his expression shifted. Less stone, more earth. You can take the cot in Ellie's room, he said. Just for tonight. Maggie looked down at the sleeping girl, then at the quiet man who had done much and said little. All right, she whispered. The room he gave her was narrow, just a cot, a washstand, and a small window facing the barn. Clean, though, and the blankets smelled faintly of cedar. Maggie kept her carpetbag by the bed, ready to leave the moment she found work. She would not overstay. Days passed, but work did not. The dressmaker already had help. The school post was filled. The saloon offered her a job pouring whiskey, but when Jonah overheard, he shook his head so firmly that she declined before she had time to think about it. So she stayed, just for now, she told herself. She swept floors, patched Ellie's dresses, and taught the child to read from an old Bible on the shelf. She baked biscuits even though the flour was coarse and the lard was close to turning. She fixed the back door hinge and mended the tear in Jonah's work shirt at the elbow. She never asked for thanks. She simply did things. Something changed. The house, once quiet except for the crack of firewood and the rasp of a carving knife, began to hold stray threads of laughter, soft, unplanned. Ellie chased chickens in the yard and danced in the kitchen, while Maggie stirred stew. The rooms felt warmer, like people actually lived there. Jonah noticed. He didn't say so, but Maggie sometimes caught him watching her over the rim of his coffee or from the workbench out back. The look in his eyes wasn't suspicious or possessive. It was the look of a man surprised by his own relief, as if he could not quite believe the house felt different and he hadn't asked for it to. The town noticed, too. At the mercantile, Mrs. Albright leaned too close as Maggie checked a spool of thread. "People are saying Jonah Kane's harboring another man's bride," she whispered. "Shameful, with a child in the house." Maggie froze. She set the thread down and walked out with her head high. That evening she said nothing. When Jonah found his mended shirt folded on his chair, there was no note, just small, tidy stitches holding worn cloth steady. A week slipped by, then another. One windy night, with shutters rattling and the planes howling, Maggie sat by the hearth while Jonah cleaned his tools. Ellie slept already. The fire sagged low. Maggie stood, smoothed her dress, and moved toward the door. Jonah looked up. "I want to thank you," she said, eyes on the latch, "for letting me stay. But I think I should go now. I'll find work elsewhere." He didn't answer at once. The quiet stretched between them, thin and tight. He set his tools aside and rose. By the time she touched the latch, he was already on the porch, arms folded, wind tugging his sleeves. "Where will you go?" he asked. "I'll find a way," she said. "You said that 2 weeks ago." "I meant it then, too." He stepped just far enough for the firelight to catch the edge of his face. He looked like something carved out of old wood and old memory. "If you leave," he said softly, "she'll dream again." Maggie blinked. "Dream." "The night you arrived, she told me you came from her dreams, said you were her mother. You saw how hard she clung to that." He paused. "If you walk away now, she'll wake up every night waiting for someone who never came, like her real mother. I won't do that to her again." "I'm not her mother," Maggie whispered. "No," he agreed. "But you're the only woman who's ever looked at her like she matters." A gust curled dust around their feet. Maggie let go of the latch. Inside, Ellie stirred and murmured in her sleep. Jonah turned and walked back in without another word. Maggie followed. The first time Jonah heard the name Thomas Reed mentioned in Dry Creek, it came from the blacksmith's boy, breathless from running. "He just rode in from the South Trail," the boy said. "Says he's looking for a drink and some fun." Jonah didn't react right away. He tightened a bolt on a fence post and stood. Maggie was in the garden, coaxing green from dry ground. Ellie chased a butterfly by the chicken coop, giggling. Jonah wiped his hands on a rag and headed for town. The saloon was half full, a haze of smoke and sweat hanging from its ceiling. Laughter drifted out the swinging doors. Inside, a slick-haired man with a crooked grin leaned at the bar, telling anyone who'd listen. "I sent a letter," he boasted. "Told her I'd marry her and bring her west. Figured I'd take a look and see if she was worth the trouble." He tossed back a drink and smirked. "She looked older than I thought. Worn. I never intended to show." Some men chuckled uneasy. Others shifted, eyes down. Jonah stepped in, slow and steady. The man turned when Jonah's stare fell on him like a shadow. "You the sheriff," he said, still smirking. "I didn't break a law. I just sold a dream." Jonah didn't speak at first. He crossed the creaking floor and stopped a few feet away. "You left her on that platform like a sack of mail," he said, voice low. "And now you're in here laughing about it." The man, Thomas Reed, shrugged. "Didn't force her to come. Just a letter." "She gave up everything," Jonah said. "She believed you." Thomas narrowed his eyes, feeling the room change. "What's it to you?" Jonah's hands stayed open at his sides. He didn't grab his belt. He didn't raise a fist. He just stood there like a storm before lightning. "It's this," he said finally. "She's not your bride." Never was. Thomas snorted. Is that so? That's so, Jonah said. Because Maggie Callahan isn't waiting to be claimed. She's already family. The saloon went still. A man lowered his glass. Another took off his hat, without meaning to. The piano player let his hands fall from the keys. Thomas gave a short laugh. You married her? No, Jonah said. But my girl calls her Mama. That's worth more than anything you wrote on paper. Thomas tried to puff himself up, but he didn't match Jonah's height or calm. Easy to play hero with a housekeeper, he spat. She's not a housekeeper, Jonah answered without blinking. She's the reason my daughter sleeps. She's the warmth in a house that's been cold for too long. He leaned close enough that the words had weight. You came to brag. Now ride out. If I hear you say her name again, you'll learn how quiet Carpenter can be when he's burying something he doesn't want found. Thomas backed down. He scoffed, threw coins on the bar, and swaggered toward the doors with more show than courage. No one laughed. No one followed. The room stayed hushed after he left. Jonah looked around once, then walked out into the street. No applause. No more words. Just a man who had said what needed saying. Maggie never asked about that afternoon. But when Jonah hung his hat on the peg and reached for the spoon she used to stir the soup, he said, I'll finish that. Their hands touched, and neither moved away. Fear spreads faster than wildfire in a small town. Dry Creek had survived droughts, flames, and snow, but this was different. It started with a cough, a child, then 2, then 5. Within days, fever ran through the young like a bad wind. Mothers kept watch by bedsides. Fathers rode out looking for a doctor who never arrived. The town physician packed up by the third night and left a note. By my skill. Pray. That was all. Maggie didn't pray. She worked. War had trained her hands to move steady. She boiled linens, mixed what herbs she could find, and measured out willow bark tea for the hottest fevers. House to house, she went, checking pulses, cooling foreheads, giving comfort where she could. Jonah stayed at her side, not a healer, but a strong, quiet helper. He hauled water, split wood, ground roots into paste. Word traveled fast. The woman some had mocked as unwanted was keeping their children alive. Then Ellie fell sick. It began with a shiver at supper. A faint flush rose in her cheeks. By morning, she couldn't lift her doll. Maggie didn't waste a second. She stripped the bed, boiled every cloth in the house, and made a small cot by the fireplace where she could keep the girl close. Jonah hovered, helpless in a way that split him open. His bright child lay small and still in the crook of Maggie's arm, breath shallow. I need more bark, Maggie said, not lifting her gaze. And water from the spring. Clean. Jonah nodded and ran. Maggie sat by the fire and wiped Ellie's face again and again. She whispered stories, fields of daisies, horses with wings, mothers who never leave. Ellie moaned, lips cracked, eyes barely open. Mama, she breathed. Don't let me die. The words cut Maggie to the bone. I'm here, she said, voice steady though her soul shook. I'm right here, sweetheart. Hold on. Jonah came back with bark and water, dirt under his nails. Together they worked through the night, boiling, cooling, wrapping, praying without saying so. As the fire sank, Jonah slid to the floor beside Ellie's cot. He took her burning little hand. She's strong, he murmured more to himself than to Maggie. Always has been. She gets that from you, Maggie said, crouching beside him. He didn't answer. He just held his daughter's hand like it was the last true thing in the world. Maggie set her palm on his shoulder. For a breath, he didn't move. Then he leaned into her touch just a little, but enough. They spoke no words. They didn't need to. In the hush of firelight and fevered breaths, something took root, raw and real, quiet as two people choosing to carry the same weight. Dawn brushed the window pale pink when Ellie stirred and whispered, "Mama," again, but this time her breath didn't shake. Maggie cried for the first time in years, silent tears into her sleeve where she thought no one would see. Jonas saw. He reached for her hand, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The fever swept through Dry Creek like a ghost wind, leaving fear in every doorway. But at last, the sickness began to break. The air turned cool again, and children who had once burned with fever now ran barefoot through the dusty streets, laughing. Mothers wept from relief. Fathers tipped their hats to Maggie when she passed. In their eyes, she was no longer the woman no one wanted. She was Miss Maggie, the one who stayed when everyone else ran. A week after the last child recovered, the townsfolk gathered at the small chapel for a supper in her honor. Tables were filled with pots of stew, cornbread, venison pie, and jars of pickled beets. Maggie stood toward the back, smiling politely as people approached to thank her. Some offered her fresh eggs, some a dress. One woman even offered a cow. Maggie accepted nothing but their kind words. Jonah wasn't there at first, but as twilight deepened and lanterns glowed warm against the chapel walls, he finally appeared in the doorway, freshly shaved, boots cleaned, a small wooden box in his hand. Maggie noticed him right away. He didn't draw attention, but somehow the air seemed to hush around him. Ellie ran to him, tugging at his sleeve. "Did you bring it, Papa?" she whispered. Jonah nodded and handed her the box. The girl hurried toward Maggie, grinning so wide her freckles seemed to dance. "Open it," she said breathlessly. Inside was a ring, simple, handmade, silver worn smooth around the edges. It wasn't polished or shiny, but it caught the light softly like something meant to last. Maggie looked up, surprised, as Jonah stepped beside her, holding his hat in his hands. "I melted down my mother's spoon," he said quietly. "It took me a week to shape it." She opened her mouth, but he lifted a hand to stop her, calm and steady. "I'm not a man of speeches," he said. "Never was. And I didn't write you letters." Maggie's throat tightened. "I didn't send for you," he went on. "But you came anyway. You turned that house into a home. Turned my daughter's dreams into mornings that don't start with tears. You took silence and made it something that feels alive again." Lantern light flickered over his face, catching the truth in his words. "I don't need a preacher's blessing or papers," he said. "I just need you to say yes." He didn't kneel. He didn't make a show of it. He just stood there, solid, quiet, offering everything he had in his own way. Maggie stared at the ring, then at his hands, scarred, steady, real. Her eyes drifted to Ellie, who was watching them both, her face bright with hope. Then she looked back at Jonah, the man who never promised anything but gave her everything that mattered. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Yes." Jonah nodded once. He slid the ring gently onto her finger. It didn't sparkle, but it fit perfectly. The wedding was small, held behind Jonah's house on the open prairie where tall grass waved in the wind like the sea. The sky stretched wide and endless, bluer than she'd ever seen. Maggie wore a dress she'd sewn herself, ivory cotton with a row of mother-of-pearl buttons she'd found in an old drawer. Her hair was pinned back neatly, and Ellie had tucked a wildflower behind her ear before it began. Jonah wore his cleanest shirt and boots polished with bacon grease. He didn't say much that morning, but when his eyes met hers, Maggie felt steadier than any altar could make her. Ellie stood between them, barefoot in a faded blue dress, holding a bundle of daisies and goldenrod she had picked herself. She beamed up at Maggie like the sun had chosen her face to rest on. The people of Dry Creek gathered quietly around, the same folks who once pitied her at the train station. Now they smiled like she truly belonged. The pastor kept the ceremony short. No fancy words, just vows said in low, sure voices. Promises were made through touch and through silence. Afterward, there was pie and lemonade. The blacksmith's brother played a tune on his fiddle, while children ran through the tall grass. The scent of honeysuckle floated in the wind. Jonah's laughter, quiet but real, mixed with Ellie's giggles and the low hum of the people who once doubted and now celebrated them. As evening fell and lanterns flickered, Maggie sat beneath the big oak near the house. In her lap was a folded letter, its edges worn soft, its ink long faded. But this time it wasn't Thomas Reed's letter. It was one she had written silently in her heart, to someone far away. She opened it in her thoughts and read aloud softly, though no one else could hear. Dear Mama, you once told me love would come when I least expected it. I never expected it at all. Not when I stepped off that train. Not when I stood alone, with dust on my skirt and shame in my heart. No one claimed me that day. I wasn't young enough, wasn't soft enough, wasn't anyone's dream. But a little girl reached out her hand, and a quiet man didn't look away. I wasn't chosen when I arrived, but in the end, someone saw me as what he'd been waiting for all his life. And now, I'm home. She folded the letter slowly, pressed it to her chest, and breathed out a long-held ache she hadn't known she still carried. Nearby, Jonah was speaking with the pastor. Ellie chased fireflies in the fading light, her laughter drifting through the dusk. Maggie Callahan, once unwanted, now cherished, smiled. Toward the horizon, the ring on her finger was warm from the setting sun.